Well, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Morning was the other one I think I've forgotten to say. Welcome to Serverless Office Hours, streaming live on the AWS Twitch channel, also on YouTube and Serverless Land, and also via LinkedIn Live. Today is a cool show, I think it is, other than the baubles I've got above me because it is sort of heading into Christmas time. It's a cool time to look back over the year of Serverless for 2023, and I've managed, with Anton's help, to get some of the true experts to come and navigate us through the journey of what's been happening over the past year. Yeah, and it's a bit of free form. We're going to talk about use cases, talk about what things are cool, maybe some things that are not. I don't know if there are things that are not cool. I'm just guessing over here. But remember, we are live, so please send us your questions, send us your comments. Tell us where you're from. Tell us what you've enjoyed this year. What you'd like for next year as well is always cool. So just going around the houses. Anton, welcome back. In fact, everybody, welcome back to Serverless Office Hours. We have no new people this time, so this is cool to get everybody. So yeah, Anton, tell us what you do at AWS and how's your year been so far?
I think this year been very, very productive. I gotta tell you, right? We've done a lot of good stuff. I'm a solution architect. I've been doing this for a couple of years now, right? So I'm a huge fan of serverless, coming from a non-serverless world, let's put it this way, right? I've been doing overall IT and cloud for over 10 years or a decade. So huge fan of serverless, cover serverless in solution architecture department. I primarily work with large ISV customers, right? So, that brings a lot of interesting both challenges and solutions.
Okay. And I think this year's been interesting as well, because obviously, cost optimization has been a big thing, a bit of a weird recession, because it's not really a recession. And so I think there's a lot of sort of fear going on in the industry because, just weird things that have been happening. And so, I think all of our work has been, talking about cost, and, serverless has been, I think, a really good way where you can really optimize your costs and do things differently and sort of learn some things. So it's going to be interesting to see how 2024 comes out, because some people have been able to do some good sort of IT reorganization and take some benefits. And it'll be interesting to see what the serverless world looks like in another year, with people who being forward thinking and jumping on the serverless train, I think. So Adam, next up, welcome back to Serverless Office Hours. You're also, in fact, everybody's a solutions architect other than me, so I'm the odd one out, really. But yeah, Adam, what do you focus on?
Yeah, so you'll hear a lot of similar themes. So I'm also a solutions architect that focuses on all the fun serverless stuff, working with a wide variety of customers. I did a lot this year on data. So Brian was with me announcing step functions distributed map about a year ago, and I've done a lot with that this year. Working with customers to solve various problems with like Lambda functions, distributed map, all sorts of data stuff. So been having lots of fun this year. It's been a whirlwind of a year, but a good year. Good to be here.
Cool, excellent. And Brian, you got mentioned. Tell us, what have you been up to this year?
Yeah, so this year, so like everyone else, specialist solutions architects for serverless. My main focus this year has been on event-driven architectures. So that's been really fun. I mean, my background is development. I wrote code for a long time, and event-driven architectures is a natural fit with serverless because our systems, or the systems that we use, the services that we use, are just inherently event-driven. And so one thing that has been really neat for me this year is just getting back to the basics of event-driven architecture and realizing that, while it's a natural fit for serverless, it also extends into other compute platforms like containers, or in theory you could even do use EDA on-prem. And so one of my big things is just kind of getting back to the basics and thinking about how does ordering work in an event-driven architecture, or item potency, or what are our strategies to go out and educate our customers on event-driven architectures. And then, of course, like everyone else, is trying to keep up with all the awesome announcements.
Well, that's why we're also here as well, because we can find out from all of our colleagues on the stream live about all the things we've forgotten about this year, because
Right.
there's a lot going on. So, Brian, when you're talking about event-driven architectures, and obviously you are a software developer from the before times, even though I don't think there is such a thing as before times with event-driven architectures. It's just evolved and matured over the years. What do you think that if someone was to ask, why should I adopt event-driven architectures, or what are the challenges that would block me from understanding what it is? How would you think about that?
Yeah, I like to frame it as, event-driven architecture, and I would even extend that to serverless in general. These are strategies for a business. And I like to explain to people and customers that if you're going down the event-driven architecture route, there are a lot of good reasons to do so. But again, think about it as a strategy for your business. So there are a lot of things that it offers, like, that loose coupling helps prevent cascading failures that you might find in a tightly coupled system. Serverless, there's a number of great advantages to adopting serverless as a strategy. So I always remind people, think about these as strategies versus a list of technologies. And then going from there, the question that shows up often is, where do I even get started with event-driven architecture? And so the thing that I've found and latched onto, along with a few other people internally here, to help with answer that question is domain-driven design, and more specifically event storming. So event storming is, you may have heard me talk about it before, but it's a really fun way to dive into a complex business process, break it down into its constituent parts, maybe we call them subdomains or bounded contexts, and then use that as your strategy to start building. So I've been running that with a number of customers. I've been practicing with teaching people internally also, and we're getting a lot of great feedback and some early signs of success with that.
Cool. Excellent. Yeah, we've covered domain-driven design and event storming on Serverless Office Hours, but I think we need to do a live one. I think we need to do a live event storming session, and people can join in. And
sign me up for 2024. Let's do it.
Done. Tick. Tick. And last up, Heeki. How are you, Heeki? Also one of our experts with serverless. How's your 2023 been?
It's been great. I look back. So again, I'm also a solutions architect, like Anton, Adam, and Brian. I tend to focus on a customer segment that we call strategics. So these kind of represent some of our larger customers, and they have a very particular set of challenges that they're facing. So this year, I spent a lot of my time on really two topics. The first is around cost modeling. So I know Anton spends a lot of time on cost optimization, providing customers with a lot of best practices. But a lot of my customers also think about, how do I model cost? How do I think about cost in a serverless world? Like if you have, let's say, EC2 instances, or you have containers, you kind of think about, like, I run a bunch of vCPU memory for a certain amount of time, and it's kind of, I won't say it's simple, but it's easy to reason about, especially if you come from data centers. Whereas when you think about serverless models, it's really request-based pricing. So how do we think about translating from models that we're used to thinking about cost and then moving into a request-based serverless? So I spent maybe a third of my time in that space. The rest of the time, I spent a lot of time thinking about governance. And so at Reinforce earlier this year, with Josh, another one of our serverless solutions architects, we ran a workshop around governance for both serverless functions and serverless containers, and think about how do we do governance in that way. Also at reInvent, I co-spoke with Capital One, and we talked a little bit about how do we do governance on AWS specific to building serverless applications. So how do we shift some of those governance capabilities left to our developers and enable them with that? I think there's going to be some continuing work in that space. I've produced a GitHub repo where some of those samples from that reInvent talk will be available for customers later.
Yeah, I love the story. I come from an enterprise background as well, and governance and compliance are the words that sit at the back of my mind always when building these applications. And I love that you've taken that on to provide just some of the best practices, and that, I mean, they're really cool tools we've actually got out there as part of AWS and even third parties to really help with this. And it's just a knowledge gap that needs to be filled to know how to do it. So before we get going, I just want to say hello to people who are joining us. Just Jess, thank you very much for joining us via Twitch. Old friend of the show. Well, I don't think he's that old, but a friend of the show. That's the wrong way around to say it. AJ Stivenberg, great to see everybody here. I see he joined at 4 minutes past the hour, so I hope it wasn't too long of a cold start. Sorry, I just had to do that. And then Alpa Codes, who I actually met at, at reInvent. That was super cool to meet you. Thanks for coming up. Thanks for joining us on Twitch. Event Storming, App Composer, Workflow Studio opens up really interesting workflows. Well, we're actually going to probably be talking about that today as well. So, Anton, should we head over to you? I know you've got some things to kick us off with to think about over the past year of some of the releases.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we had several. Well, we had plenty of releases last year. Well, still this year, right? In various aspects, right? So if you followed our blogs and announcements from reInvent, you've probably seen new capabilities like direct HTTP integrations and step functions. I've been waiting for this, right? This will help me a lot of the workflows, right? All the improvements we did, for example, with Event Bridge, okay, things like additional debugging capabilities. Now you can actually trace what's going on better. If you ask me what are my favorites are, right? I gotta tell you 2 scaling updates, right? One for the overall Lambda scaling and another one for Lambda SQS event source scaling, right? Those 2 capabilities are heavily used by many of my customers. And the fact that both Lambda and SQS event source can scale significantly faster now, up to 5 times faster for SQS event source, up to 12 times faster for Lambda functions, those are major, major improvements, major launches that will help my customers, right? Especially now in holiday season, right? The workloads are pretty spiky. You have your New Year's sale, you have your holiday sales, right? All the events, concerts, right? So these 2 capabilities are going to make a lot of people happy. Well, made a lot of people happy.
Definitely. In fact, last week we did, in fact, a 2-hour live stream just on the AWS Twitch channel. So go and have a look at that. There was part of, I think, a 5-hour day talking all about reInvent things. And last Tuesday was Serverless Day, the Serverless Day part of it. And just demoing the Lambda, the scale up. I think previously, if you needed 10,000 sustained requests, which is a huge, you're running a pretty big website already when you've got 10,000 sustained requests. That's never mind what you're doing in requests per second. And they used to take, I think, 12 minutes to cycle all the way up to that. And now it's 90 seconds. So if you think you've got 90 seconds to get 10,000 sustained requests, that's just so much quicker. And the cool thing about it is it's no longer shared. So every single function anywhere in the world can scale up to that amount. So just one of those little things that you had to remember and understand the different regions and different scaling mechanisms. That's no longer the case, and they don't need to share. So I love the simplicity of that one, Anton. That was also just done.
And to add on top of that, right? If you've monitored like a few days ago, I think it was last week, if I recall correctly, it was after reInvent. There was also one capability that was kind of silently released, right? We didn't make like a lot of noise about it, but it actually complements this whole story, right? That's the new metric that we're getting for Lambda of how many remaining concurrency you have available, right? So if you're using Lambda at scale, you might have some functions using provision concurrency. You might have some functions using reserved concurrency. You might have some functions doing on demand, right? And up till that release, it was a little bit challenging to understand. So all of those concurrency allocated, all of that concurrency allocated, how much do I actually have left, right? So you don't need to monitor how much capacity you've allocated. You can easily monitor how much do you have, how much concurrency you have remaining, right? And that will definitely help you to, make your system are more predictable, right? And you can understand when do you need to, open the request for more concurrency. So that capability was announced, I think, last week, if I recall correctly. New metric, out of the box, no need to do anything. It's just there. So I'm definitely happy about that.
Yeah. And actually, just while we're talking all about releases, if you go to serverlessland.com/what's new, there's a filtering list of all the releases that have come about, for ages. So you can filter on Lambda, step functions, Event Bridge, any of the serverless services. And so, if you are wanting to dive in and read more, that's an easy way to do it. So Anton, what's up? Do you have a deck you want to share, or are we just going to chat about these things? You can see we've done obviously huge amounts of pre-preparation of exactly what we're going to talk about, but that's part of the fun.
Yeah, I can share a few slides. Okay, let me start sharing my screen.
Actually, yes, Let's check.
Maybe while Anton's getting that up,
Yeah.
he brought up the SQS event source mapping, kind of increased scale there. The other one that launched this year is on the other end of things. So sometimes people are using SQS between services as a way to basically smooth out like spikes in traffic that kind of come in. So maybe you have a back-end service that doesn't scale super well, and you have a front-end service that can see these real big spikes. You put SQS in between them, and in the past it was a little bit challenging to consume those messages with Lambda and not have it scale up a lot. So now we have this maximum concurrency feature in the SQS ESM that allows you to limit the max number of Lambda functions that will be consuming from that SQS queue. So really useful if you need to kind of protect a downstream service from big bursts of traffic. So I love the high scale stuff, but also sometimes you have to talk to stuff that's not written in Lambda and API Gateway and other services that scale to the moon.
And that release was really nice because it made such logical sense, because before what would happen is, and the ESM, if that's the event source mapping, it's basically this polar that Lambda runs for free, a bunch of whole different event sources. And what actually used to happen before is the polar would grab messages from SQS, send it to Lambda, and Lambda you'd configure your throttle at Lambda, and Lambda would go, no, I can't. And it was just silly to be having unnecessary invokes, and now you just configure it on your event source mapping resource itself, and it just makes sense. Like how many concurrent things do you want to pull from Lambda? Job done. So yeah, much easier. And in fact, also talking about the scaling kind of thing, I also want to throw in a bunch of work I've been doing this year in the whole Kafka world as well, because the Kafka scaling has also improved as well. Whole bunch of different things that have happened with that it scales up much faster, has more initial polars, and then also doesn't scale down as fast as well. So yeah, in terms of what Anton was talking about, and I'm talking about in terms of Kafka scaling, you just see the graph, and it used to be like that, and now it's like that. And this is literally just done for you. Nothing you need to reconfigure or do anything. I always joke that these are some of the releases where I'm sure we get support calls with a support organization going, something is weirdly going on. Something is scaling up far faster and it's way more responsive. I think something is wrong. What's going on? And then the support people have to gently mention, well, yeah, it's something we built on Lambda behind the scenes. Something is much faster. You haven't done anything wrong. Good for you. And everyone's like, oh, phew, thank you very much. It's faster, and off they go. So I like those kind of announcements.
Yeah, one thing I'd throw in there too, and I don't want to steal, if Anton has some slides, I don't want to steal his thunder, but if you look at the announcements, there are a number of improvements that all have to do with scaling. Yeah. So, I don't know if we mentioned, the faster scale up with SQS FIFO queues, MSK, Lambda. And so the thing that, for me, with my developer hat on, that's really exciting is just, now, with Lambda, it's really becoming just, again, more and more powerful. And I don't know any other system that just continues to add, almost instant scalability like that. It's really amazing. And I think the one thing I would encourage people to do is also think about, scaling not just Lambda, but again, it's all these integrations. So it's really the whole picture that we need to look at in terms of capabilities when working on a compute platform.
Yeah. And I think SQS FIFO, isn't that, is it 7,000 or even 70,000 messages per second? 70,000 messages per second. Like, oh yeah, that SQS FIFO, yeah, well, you need ordering, but it's still going to be slow. Like 70,000 messages a second. That is just crazy.
And keep in mind, I've also introduced the new JSON protocol for SQS, right? So things will be even faster, right? Because JSON is more optimal format. Right now, go ahead, Julian.
No, I was just going to say that's so funny. That was one of the announcements which I didn't realize that the previous protocol had been there for 17 years, I think 16 or 17 years, and you think, wow.
Yep. So one thing I want to add to this discussion, right, is it's interesting, right? We're talking about more scaling. We're talking about building, bigger systems that scale better, systems that can, serve more traffic, right, handle more. But, one of my favorite quotes is, with great power comes great responsibility. okay, all the way from the Marvel end. And the idea is, yeah, you can have a system that is processing millions, maybe even billions of pieces of data over the course of whatever the time frame is, right? But you always need to be kind of cognizant of, so what happens if things go south, right? What happens if suddenly I have like a 20% error rate, right? And 20% or even 2% of billion messages, that's still quite a lot, right? So how do I actually get insights into that? So I'm very happy that, throughout this year, we've also delivered quite a lot of observability improvements over the whole portfolio of our services, right? So if you talk about EventBridge, right, you have, like I mentioned, you have debug logs that you can see for pipe. If you want SQS is now logging, if you want, it can log data events. This is huge, right? You can get logged for data events, not just control plane, but also data plane events, right? It can help you with debugging. Lambda introduced several improvements in the logging department, things like log levels, right? So now you can actually control log levels of your function as a function configuration. No need to change code. You just log level, right? And it will be immediate. Things like, what else do we have here? Native support for JSON logging, so you can easily query your logs. Support for custom log groups. So previously had log group per function. So if you had and this was a very common in my domain, right, in ISVs, they're still operating, they're operating with the concept of microservices. And it's common to have several functions comprised of microservice. Right.
So, and so just to jump in quickly, just while we're talking observability, are you actually advancing the slides? Because it doesn't look as though the slides are advancing.
No. I'm just talking.
Just
I'm going to go through the slides. And by the way,
the metrics are working.
yeah, everything in these slides, I've shared it on LinkedIn and in a bunch of other places. And it says December 2023. I plan to keep it updated all the way to January. And you might see events like AWS webinars popping up here and there saying, let's talk about what's new in serverless, right? So yeah, okay. Well, let's go through the slides. I've talked about a bunch of the stuff that we have on slides, but two things I want to emphasize is make sure everyone you have those digital learning badges, right? You have to demonstrate your serverless knowledge. Right. About a year ago, we introduced the serverless learning badge. Right. Recently, we've also introduced events and workflows learning badge. Got QR codes here. You got links here. It's a learning path of, if I recall correctly, something like 8 to 10 hours of content, which is all of that is great. And then in the end, you have to take a quiz of several dozen questions that will essentially get you that learning badge. You can put it on your link. You can demonstrate your knowledge of serverless. This is great. If you're a big fan of serverless, but for whatever reason you've missed reInvent or couldn't attend every single session, there is a playlist for all the serverless compute stuff on YouTube, managed by AWS Events channel, right? Julian, I think you had even a bigger playlist on serverless land, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, I've put that on. So the one at the bottom of the screen is everything that's in the serverless compute playlist, and then a few other ones from some of the community track and the containers track and other kind of things that are relevant. And happy to add anything more if anybody spots anything that they feel would be good.
Absolutely, because I think this is great, right? This is how I've been burning, at least an hour a day, right? After work, I'm just watching those videos and learning what's new, right? Because I know some of that stuff, maybe I know most of the stuff, but seeing that actually gives you like additional context, right? Full disclosure, I do watch it usually on fast forward, like 125, 150%, right? So I'm still getting all the questions. Cool. Well, let me quickly glance through Lambda slides, and guys, maybe you want to, like Brian, maybe you want to talk about EventBridge or step functions after that, right? Because we've already discussed many of these things. Lambda functions scale up to 12 times faster. And keep in mind, this is per function. This is the big thing that we need to emphasize. This is no longer for account. This is per function. We've released a bunch of new Lambda runtimes, right? All of them were announced. We had blogs, Node 20, Python 3.12, Java 21, Amazon Linux 2023. So all of these runtimes were released roughly throughout the reInvent timeframe, plus minus a week, right? So you can start, converting your functions or building new ones with the latest and greatest runtimes. This is big.
Yeah. And also, just to interject, in terms of that, you can see that there've been a whole bunch of announcements for runtimes recently. And, to be honest, things were much slower in the beginning of the year. And basically, the Lambda team behind the scenes has rejigged the entire way they release the runtimes. And now we actually have a public commitment that within sort of 60-ish days from an LTS runtime release, we hope to have a runtime out to support that. So, yeah, huge amount of work behind the scenes from the Lambda team to be able to get these runtimes out. So yeah, as new runtimes are coming out, you will see they will be coming out much quicker. Also, if you didn't know, they're actually container images that are released really quickly after the runtimes come out, so you can at least start to do some testing. Because yeah, some of these new runtimes do have some weird and wonderful things. Some of them are performance improvements, some of them just have weird things that work with Lambda, and so the Lambda team wants to test them as broadly as possible to be able to ensure that we can knock any issues on their head as quick as possible. So yeah, that just so going in the future, all the runtimes are going to be coming out quickly.
Yep. So this one, let me talk about a minute about this one, right? So we're usually, when we're announcing new stuff, we're talking about new features, right? And I think it's very important not just talk about new features, right, but to talk about new solutions, new approaches, right? And those are not necessarily your business use cases, right, but those are how do you tackle a particular problem, right? And this is where I think our serverless compute blog actually shines. So I decided to include several of those blog posts, right, in this deck, because I think those are huge, right, and they address a very specific concern that we're seeing for customers. So, for example, let's explain, the major Lambda runtime upgrades, right? If you're consuming serverless, you will hit this question at some point in time, right? Older runtimes being deprecated, newer runtimes, we're releasing them all the time. This is not just serverless thing, right? Doesn't matter which compute option you're using. You need to update your runtimes, right? With serverless, it's just easier. We'll do it for you, but you need to make sure your code 18, node 20, node 22, 24, whatever the next releases are going to be. So we've released a series of blogs talking about different use cases. Since previous slide was about new runtimes, there is also a really good blog talking about how do you manage those runtime upgrades without disruptions, right, with no impact to your environment. So I really enjoyed reading it. Highly recommend. What else? We talked about controls. I love that, right? As a developer, this is super convenient to you now. Next time, there's a problem that needs to be solved, the operations, right, can essentially change the log levels of Lambda function and get those logs without involving development, right? I think this is a really powerful capability. SQS polling scale up, it's great, right? Just to throw in two numbers there to get from 0 concurrency to maximum concurrency with SQS used to take about 21, 22 minutes. Now it's about 4 minutes. This is a huge improvement, right? If you have a spiky workloads, you're going to enjoy this capability. Improved concurrency quota monitoring, talked about that as well. Now you can monitor the remaining concurrency, right? So how much concurrency you have left, unreserved concurrency. Triggering Lambda function cross account with MSK, right? I think the formatting here is broken a little bit, not a big deal, right? So previously you can only trigger Lambda function with MSK with the same account. Now you can actually do it across. Really powerful capability.
I know, Heeki, you had mentioned this before. What were you going to talk about this? Because I think some of this cross account stuff is super, super important. So what were your sort of insights on that?
Yeah, this one was important. Again, as I had mentioned at the beginning, I work with a lot of enterprise customers, and they typically, I see oftentimes they'll use Kafka as a mechanism for log ingestion across their enterprise. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll have a shared services account where these Kafka clusters will reside, and they want everyone to then funnel them in. What they also want then is to have the Lambda functions reside in their line of business accounts, right? And so this then allows you architecturally to say we have shared services that allow for this centralization of logging. but allow then the application teams to say, hey, we want to do certain things with our logs and deploy functions in their own accounts. So this is just a really good enabler for just different enterprise patterns that I see.
Yeah, perfect.
Yep. So Julian, I think you've mentioned the scaling improvements for Kafka event source, right? Also, a lot of stuff, in this department. To wrap up Lambda, right? I don't want to take too much time. This was one of my big projects for this year. It's how to enhance runtime security through the API proxy. And again, this is not a feature. This is a solution, right? How do you take existing capabilities and actually build solutions with these existing capabilities? So I work a lot with security partners, security companies, and they were looking for ways, how do they actually implement something like event and response filtering solutions or audit solutions, right? How do they, for example, sanitize data, right? They make sure that developer never ever returns, social security number or some other sensitive information. So this actually helps you to achieve that. So like I said, a lot of great stuff in the Lambda department, right? I don't know, Brian, you want to talk a little bit about step functions and event bridge?
Well, just before we get to that quickly, because I just did, these are some of the older things that happened from Lambda, even early on in the year, which we, just to quickly go through, like Lambda response streaming, that is super cool. It's even got even cooler because, people are now realizing that they can connect it up with Bedrock. And so you can stream Gen AI stuff, through a Lambda function, which is super cool. We will mention it later as well, but power tools, like if you are building Lambda functions, just use power tools. It's going to make your life so much easier. And the .NET one went GA this year, and the other languages, Python, TypeScript, JavaScript, and I'm sure I've forgotten another one, Python, Java. I said JavaScript, and I was like, I said Java. It's not the same thing, obviously. They are just cranking out more and more releases. And even behind the scenes, it's actually a full team. Before, it was just a bunch of really clever solutions architects, like people on this call doing it, for love in their own time. Now, literally, it's a whole fully funded team. So that is super cool. So yeah, I was just going to quickly talk about some of the earlier year things before we head over to EventBridge. Yeah, well, Brian, do you want to tackle on EventBridge? This is going to be fun because Brian doesn't know what the next slide is, so it's going to be.
I don't, so it's going to be a pop quiz. But yeah, hit next, and we'll see how I do. Yeah. So this one was launched a little bit before reInvent, and this is the ability to have read-only events through CloudTrail show up through EventBridge. And so previously, what would happen? I know this was really important for many of Anton's customers in the ISV space, with the security space. So what people wanted to do was, there's a large number of people using EventBridge for security purposes. So set up a CloudTrail and then digest those events through EventBridge and then do something with them. So for example, if someone's changing a secret in Secrets Manager, the security team is going to want to know about that. And so previously, that was only available for mutating events. So if someone, again, created a new secret, deleted one, updated one. And so what this does now is it gives customers the ability to just see anything that is any type of event, whether it's a read or a write event. So this one's, on the screen, it shows get secret value. So that's a non-mutating event, but now that shows up in a CloudTrail, and we'll go over. You can ingest that through EventBridge and then again do something with it. And I think, Heeki, did you write the blog for this one?
Yeah, I did.
I was looking at this morning. I thought I saw your name. So yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I'll add two things. One is so people might say, what do you mean by read only? So if you think about the API actions, get, list, and describe, those actions previously were not included for these type of CloudTrail mechanisms. As you could imagine, those are high volume because there are many read-only actions happening within your account. So this is something to be aware of, that you want to make sure that your filters are set correctly when you're enabling this capability.
Yeah.
Yep, and I think you do have to set up the CloudTrail to emit these events, right? These do not show up automatically. This is something that you need to configure on the CloudTrail when you're setting that up.
That's right. Yeah, and if you read the blog post, I think we have like 2 example scenarios. Again, I'm sure many of our customers will find many other use cases for enabling this, but we try to give 2 examples that may be relevant for our customers. So go check out the blog.
Yeah, this is a really powerful capability. Let's see. It's all about
this one. This is This is one of my favorites. So yeah, just metrics, observability, monitoring, whatever you want to call it. This is one of those weird things that I just love. I love it because it's an art and a science. And so, the art of it is figuring out what makes sense for you and your business. There's never a single right answer of how to set up observability. The science of it is, what do you have available to you? And so what this is, this announcement is we've got more data to actually work with. And so I think it was 20, a little over 20 new EventBridge metrics, which customers now have available to them to, again, start monitoring and figuring out what is going on with their event bus. I don't know what more there is to say there. I would just call out a few that are kind of my, weirdly, I have favorite metrics that they announced. But one is, and I think it's on the screen, is ingestion to invocation start latency. And so what that means is, whenever an event is ingested, so EventBridge receives it, how long does it take until the target is invoked? It was when it started the processing. And so really what that shows is, what customers were asking is, hey, sometimes we'd field requests, and the requests were, EventBridge is being really slow. And when we go and talk to them, it was really that EventBridge would they call put events, and then they wouldn't see the result of that for some time later. And so we'd have to go through and ask, well, is it that the target is slow? Maybe it's a Lambda function, maybe it's a step function workflow, whatever. So before, you could only see the end-to-end latency. And so now what you can do is see how long it takes from when the event is ingested by EventBridge to when it started invoking the downstream target. And so that really is going to show you the true latency of EventBridge. And then the other one that's related to that is the complete latency. Again, that's the blue box or down there in the list of graph metrics. So that is the full end-to-end, from start invocation to all the way to completed running whatever that processing is.
Cool.
One thing that I would add there too, also, that I've seen some customers ask about, which we've now released, is that matched events metric. So for example, when you configure filtering, if something does not match the filter, it will essentially get dropped. Sometimes customers want to be aware, like, I might have 1 million messages per second coming through EventBridge, but my downstream target only got 20, right? And so before this metric was made available, they had to kind of figure out some things on their side. So they would emit certain metrics, and then they would check on the other side, and they would kind of do their own diff to kind of calculate that. Now this is one of those things where you just get this out of the box, and this is really helpful for customers.
Yep. Yeah, that's another good one.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is a good one. It's like, read the blog. There's a lot of detail in here. But there's a lot more to work with now.
And since we already mentioned filtering, right? So EventBridge filtering now supports wildcards, right? So I think this one is also pretty powerful. Allows you to have more fine-grained filtering, right? So you can see the example on your screen right now. You can actually have a wildcard and filter your events. Okay. Cool. I think we got step functions next.
Well, okay. Just before I'm going to go, I'm going to be the old man talking just quickly about the beginning of the year, because when I was making my silly joke at the beginning about people phoning up the support line and going, hang on, something's wrong, things are much faster. We literally did get support calls about EventBridge latency dropping from, here's 110 milliseconds to 150 milliseconds. That's exactly it. Everyone thinks, async must be slow, it's painful, I'm not going to be able to use it. There you go. EventBridge knocked it out the park, drastically reducing their end-to-end latency. If you're in the Kafka world, a Kafka Connect plugin for EventBridge, that is super cool. Lots of people with on-premises or Kafka in the cloud, but they want to use EventBridge for its filtering and its routing and all this kind of things. Now you can just pump Kafka messages into EventBridge. That's super cool. And here, the last one, seems so silly, but so useful. This is EventBridge Scheduler. Once you can have many millions of schedules, or is it a lot of schedules? But now that you can just delete them automatically once they're finished, so you don't have to have any sort of tidy up procedures. So yeah, that was early back in the year, but then onto step functions. Yeah. I don't know who wants to have a restarting failed workflows. I could summon
Adam had to leave because I think he was going to cover step functions, but I can speak to this one a little bit. So before before this release, if a step function workflow would fail at any state, the scenario would be, imagine the, one state in a workflow is going to talk to some system, and that system for some whatever reason is not healthy, and that would break, that would crash the whole workflow, and the workflow was done. And so what this allows you to do now is to redrive or recover or restart the workflow right from where it failed. So imagine a scenario where you have a workflow that it could be taking multiple hours because the work that's doing is hard and it takes a lot of processing power. I had a customer that was doing a lot of data processing, and so they had multiple steps at the beginning that would take literally many minutes or even up to hours. And so if one step at the bottom of that fails because again a downstream resource is unhealthy or just is facing some errors, this will allow you to restart that whole process without going to the very, very top and redoing a bunch of unnecessary work.
Just a general question about step functions. With the amount of step functions work I do, I see very few solutions where step functions would not be a great fit for doing something in your workloads. And obviously, I live and breathe within the AWS serverless org, so we see that all the time. But what do you see as solutions architects, sort of more out in the field, with how customers are adopting step functions, or what's that first thing they need to do to realize that, wow, step functions is really amazing? Because I honestly wouldn't consider many workloads without looking at step functions first. But how can people sort of jump that gap, or is there a gap even in terms of adopting step functions, and how are people finding it useful?
I can go first. I think one of the things that we often say with Lambda is whenever you're writing code, if at any point in your code you're sitting there waiting or you're blocking on I/O, you are basically paying for idle, which is not ideal. So what I love in some of these new integrations, I think in a couple slides we'll talk about HTTPS integrations. But if, for example, you're making an API call to some other downstream endpoint and it takes 10 seconds to respond or whatever that might be, like these are opportunities where step functions can do work on your behalf. So like all of this waiting where Lambda would essentially just sit there idle, blocking on I/O, I think that's a great place where customers can do this. And Julian, I think to your initial question of like, how can we get our customers, or how can you as customers out there listening get started quickly? And I think maybe Brian may have a demo, or if we have time for this, like I think for me, like the Step Functions Workflow Studio Editor, like I think it was released like 2 years ago, something like that. But that's such a great way for customers to get visually started and getting ramped up pretty quickly. If you remember back in like the 90s, there used to be like the WYSIWYG editors for building websites, right? This is kind of like the WYSIWYG editor of building step functions. It makes it really easy. And so, I think I see kind of those two things happening with step functions.
Oh, great. Yeah, I mean, I know, Brian, you did. It was slightly different that you were wanting to show step functions and app composer all together. We could do that now if that fits in.
Sure. Yeah. I will get my
Now you're probably on the spot, yeah.
Up and
give me a second. Why don't you set that up, and we can just we can look at like the next some of the next things, and then we can cover it while we properly put Brian on the spot.
All
we
right.
didn't show him the next slide and then said, "Can you do a demo?" How about that?
Yeah,
so
maybe
Bedrock optimized integration. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the real benefits of step functions with the SDK integrations, that it literally just connects to any SDK action. I think it's over 11,000 of them. And then we go even more, and we have optimized integrations with a number of services, even things like Lambda. So when step functions integrates with Lambda, it's got a payload it sends to Lambda, some JSON it needs to get back, and a whole bunch of configuration it can do. So now step functions and Bedrock has an optimized integration where you can, in this example, I think it's actually selecting a couple of different models to run doing something. So it can invoke different models, can come back and in a parallel state, can come back and then decide maybe which one is the best one. You can have a human in the loop to go and pick what it's going to be. But yeah, if you think of how generative AI has taken the world by storm this year, and if you think, what is generative AI? It is accessing an API over the internet where you give it a prompt and you get a response. I mean, not to be flippant about what generative AI, the awesome stuff it's doing, but in terms of interacting with it, You're sending it a prompt and you're getting a response back over an API endpoint on the internet. And that is just, the perfect serverless way to use something. And so with Step Functions has this optimized integration, which just makes it so much easier to be able to use Bedrock. And really, if you're building applications and trying to understand how you can introduce some generative AI capabilities into it, like creating a summary of a document, or collecting quotes, or analyzing sentiment of a document, here it is. Yeah, this is just so much easier to do it, and it's just built into your workflow. Drag and drop it onto your canvas, set some config parameters, and off you go.
I'll add two more things before Brian jumps into his demo. Like the interesting thing here is, like I just mentioned before, if you have a Lambda function and it's doing work and blocking and waiting, this is like another example. So you could do a Bedrock invoke model inside of a Lambda function. Like I was doing some work with Bedrock prior to reInvent this year, and for example, the Anthropic Claude model, that V2 model, if you do an invoke model against it, typically the response time for that initial query will be something like 10 to 20 seconds, right? And so that's something where the Lambda function, unless you're like multi-threading, and that's a whole different discussion, but that's where your Lambda function would just be sitting there blocking, waiting for that to happen. And this is a great example where Step Functions can do that on your behalf. I think there's other topics around response streaming. I think Anton had mentioned this before. Or alternatively, you could do the invoke model with response streaming, and then also integrate that with Lambda's response streaming, and then kind of get that ChatGPT-like experience, or I guess the Amazon Q experience, right? Where you're interacting with the chatbot and you kind of get those responses as it's generating. So again, this is another cool case where you can, in this case, you could actually take Lambda out of the loop if you don't need that kind of immediate end user response.
Cool. Brian, are you ready to show us something?
I'm ready.
Yeah, we've probably got a few.
We've
probably got a few minutes. I see we've got a few slides to go. We've still so much stuff happening this year. So let's
go fairly quick, but yeah. So this is obviously my editor. So this is just a very, very simple, basic AWS SAM application. And so what I'm going to use this for is to show the integration again with App Composer, and then really exciting is the integration with Workflow Studio. So I'll just dive into it. So this is the SAM application. It's a bunch of YAML. Probably people are familiar with this. And so one thing that is new is that you can I'm going to right click. Does my right click show up? Can you see that? I don't know. No, it doesn't. No. Anyway, I'm going to right click on my template. You can't see it, but there's a menu item that says open with Application Composer. And so you'll see now what has happened is App Composer has shown up, and I'm going to minimize things a little bit. And so this now is a visual representation of my templates. And so in here, you can see there's an event bridge timer. There is a step function state machine. And then what I've done here is wired up a few steps in the workflow to Lambda functions. And I've wired up one of these steps to what we were just talking about, which is an integration with DynamoDB. And so this happens to be the DynamoDB put item command. So this is really neat. Down below, what you see is some green and yellow text. And what I have in this terminal down below is I'm running SAM sync. So what SAM sync does is it's going to watch for any code changes on my local file system and deploy those automatically to AWS. One word of caution here, this is great for development. Do not do this in production. But I'm also going to talk about how this new feature is actually useful for even a production system. So if I click on the state machine and click on details, you can see over here, it shows me some details. It shows the actual definition, and then there's just some more stuff in here, specifically some references out to the Lambda functions. And so if I go back to details, what I can do now is I can actually edit my state machine visually. So I'm going to click on Edit in Workflow Studio. And so now Workflow Studio launches in my editor.
So you're not in the AWS console. You haven't left your IDE. Your developer flow is not shattered or broken. You're concentrating on the same screen.
Yep, exactly. And I think that's one thing that has been a barrier in the past for people to adopt step functions is that, what I say is it really can disrupt the developer flow, statements as developers. But you can offload a lot of that, these conditional logics or retries, to step functions. And so I think this now reduces that barrier so that it's really easy to get into, or easier to get into. And again, take advantage of what step functions can do for you. So one thing I'll do here is I'm going to, there's this choice state. And so what happens is the first Lambda function just emits some fake data and figures out, it's the value of the stock, which is just a random integer. And then here, there's this choice state. And what the choice state is doing is it's evaluating the price of the stock. So that is the make-believe stock price that we emit from the first Lambda function. And so you can see here on the right, it says, the rule number one is the stock price less than or equal to 1? And if it is, then we go and we buy it. But if otherwise, we're going to go and sell it. And so now what I can do is I'll click on this. Again, I'm in my editor, and I'll say edit conditions, and I'll change this to 10 instead of 1. And I'll save that. I'll click on save. And if you'll notice down below, the files on my local system have changed, which SamSync has picked up. And now it's deploying that to my account. Before this, what would happen is people would go into the console. They'd love the visual workflow editor, and they would change things around, but then they have to literally copy all of that that YAML out into their editor or into their their source control, paste it in there, change a bunch of variables, and then go and deploy that. And so now it's seamless. So now you can do this all within your browser and within your code editor. And if you're doing development, that was how long was that? Maybe that was 15 seconds between making a change and having it deployed on my development account. So that the cycle now is really, really fast. And if you're not doing development, if you just want to make a code change, you wouldn't have to use SamSync like I am. But what you can do is make the change in your browser, in your editor, save those, do a git commit, git push, and you're done. So we really eliminated that need to go out into the AWS console and go to Workflow Studio there. You now have all the power in your code editor.
Cool. Alpa Codes has a question. Is it preferable to create the overall step functions workflow first and then create the Lambda, etc., to wire them up, or create the Lambda functions first and reference existing resources in the step functions workflow studio?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer for this. I think it really depends on what makes sense for you and how you work and what's going to make you productive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I would say is try at least think of step functions, use it as the visual scaffolding, because as you're developing things, you may realize that your Lambda functions are just going to be SDK integrations, which you don't then need the Lambda functions. And then when you plug the gaps, then you add the Lambda functions in. But yeah, as Brian says, it's an either or. It depends what part of your what part of the stage you're building in.
I would second that, right? Because step functions, it helps you to visualize that workflow, right? You have the whole thing end to end in front of your eyes. So by kind of starting with scaffolding, you can actually figure out, okay, so I do this, but actually it only needs originally thinking, because the rest will be handled in a different place. So kind of what I really like about the workflow editor, it helps you to have more of an architectural perspective of end-to-end workflow, right? You're not focusing on each little piece like internals just yet, but you're getting the complete picture. And then based on that, you can start, implementing the business logic that you need, which is outside of scope of SDK integrations.
Cool. Thanks, Anton. Yeah, and thanks, Brian, for the demo. That is super cool to see all the visual kind of stuff. Lots of people previously, I would even say AWS Visual Designer, but seriously, the Step Functions team and App Composer team have probably knocked it out the park to be able to do that. I'm just going to go quickly because we've literally got some 2 minutes before we've got some other kind of things we need to cover. So yeah, Step Functions also earlier this year had safe deploys. I'm like, what is it? What is it? It's in the back of my mind. So you can basically now have green-blue deployments for step functions. So it just makes it much easier to roll out as well. There's HTTP endpoint support. mind-blowing. Basically, you can connect step functions to any HTTPS endpoint on the internet. So there you go. There's little Lambda functions that you needed to be able to go and call something from somewhere else, no longer needed. Yeah, test state. This is cool. Little test button in the console. Run a test, which works perfectly with a third-party API, so you can test your auth. Lots of logging that's done with this as well, so you can check exactly all the payloads and the headers and all that kind of thing. Yeah, test data, just so simple to be in the console and just be able to test anything with your workflows. Anything else to add, or I'm going quickly along, but or interrupt me if you've got something to say. SQS, Anton talked about this earlier. SQS data events also in CloudTrail. So yeah, all these kind of things, you now be able to pick them up, and if you need to do anything with them as well. We talked earlier about the JSON protocol, just makes SQS, which is infinitely scalable. Remember, I mean, crazy to think it's infinitely scalable, and now it's much faster as well. Yeah, there we said before, the FIFO queues, 70,000 transactions per second. Mind-boggling. I don't even know how SQS does it behind the hood, to be honest. That's wickedly fast. Also, obviously, redrive support for FIFO queues. So that's super useful. Things fail, you're going to put them into a DL queue, and now you can redrive them back into the source queue. Oh, I'm running through. Archive and replay with SNS as well. So yeah, just, and what's really nice is SNS and SQS are working really well together to complement some of the releases that are coming out. So some of the throughput announcements as well are coming out for both services. This is just super useful because obviously as an architectural practice, it can be very beneficial to have SQS and SNS in your architecture. And the fact that they sort of line up on a whole bunch of these things is really cool. Integration application test kit. This is super early days, but it's a big push we're doing to try and help with serverless testing, which we know can be a challenge across a whole number of different services when you're building distributed applications. This test kit is starting off with Python and just some code and info that we'll be certainly adding to be able to test your distributed applications. App Composer, I think we've covered with Brian's awesome demo. Workflow Studio is also an App Composer. SAM support for Terraform, if you didn't know that, Terraform is super awesome. Now SAM can, so if you're building your applications with Terraform, SAM can actually be a wrapper around that to be able to do local invokes, which is super useful. And we're back to the digital learning badges, but I did just want to switch quickly to some learning guides. So serverlessland.com/learn, that's the big URL. There is an amazing amount of work that a whole bunch of people have done on really good learning guides. My one is actually up first. I don't know why I did that. Not that I needed it. But if you're a beginner on Lambda and you really want a back to basics learning guide, a whole bunch of videos on Lambda fundamentals. We've then had processing Kafka streams, so a huge bunch of work if you're using Kafka with Lambda. There's also another learning guide for using Kinesis with Lambda. So yeah, basically these guides go into a bit more information. They tie together some documentation, some code repositories, some videos, a whole bunch of things together just to be able to help you out. Data processing with step functions, distributed map. We didn't even really talk too much about that today, but this is just awesome to be able to do in a real sort of high intensity, sort of very parallel processing with step functions. The DynamoDB knowledge portal, some super experts with DynamoDB put this all together. Testing serverless applications. So yeah, big focus this year, which will continue to next year. A whole bunch of stuff on automated testing, which this learning guide is, and then s12d.com/testing, which you just keep adding to with a bunch of code repositories and things for testing. Some people we recognize who've been on this call as well for cost optimization for Lambda. As I said in the beginning, a big focus of this year. So a lot of really good information on cost optimization for Lambda. Heeki, you can cover this one, I think. I'll throw it over to you quickly.
Yeah, we just talked briefly about governance, and so you can think about how we just enable your policies and controls for your serverless applications. Yeah,
really, really good info in here as well. And then, yeah, APIs. We haven't even talked about APIs much as well. But yeah, Gidrius and Artie have put together a whole big life cycle of API platforms on AWS with API gateways. So certainly take a look at this. Sam came out with a workshop. This is super useful because it's not just about learning SAM. It's all about deployments and canaries and accelerates and a whole bunch of things to make a serverless deployment easier with some tooling. And yeah, this is all sort of available and linked via serverlessland.com, including a whole bunch of patterns, infrastructures, code examples, repos, workflow snippets, a whole bunch of stuff. So Yes, I had to rush through the kind of bit, but yeah, there's been a lot been going on in 2023. I want to thank everybody who's been coming on today. Anton, Heeki, Brian, and Adam, who were on. Thanks for all your work internally at AWS as well. Really trying to champion the best use of serverless and, working with your customers and to be able to create as much content as we can to help you. And then to wrap up the year, thank you for everybody who's been watching over the whole year. We appreciate you joining us for Serverless Office Hours. We will be, sorry, I messed up Anton, I meant to say when I was running through the names. But yeah, thanks for joining us on Office Hours. We'll be continuing next year. So much more stuff to talk about. So we really appreciate you spending your time with us. And yeah, it's been great. It's been a great Serverless 2023. We won't be on next week, but the following week we will be back in January to be talking about more kind of things. So hopefully you have too much to eat in Christmas, if that's something you celebrate wherever you are. And hopefully you get too many presents, because those are all problems we all want to have. But thank you very much, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. And thank you, everybody, for joining today.
Happy holidays.